Welcome. I gave this talk to raise funds for Save the Children on the 2nd of March 2023, and the title, The Deserving Poor, requires some explanation because it raises the question, well, who are the undeserving poor that don't deserve our charity? Well, the Victorians had an answer to that question, and I'll illustrate it using paintings from the period. But before then, let's start at the beginning. Almost 900 years ago, this building was founded, the Hospital of St. Cross and Almshouse of Noble Poverty in Winchester. It was founded in 1136 and has been described as England's oldest and most perfect almshouse. In fact, at the time, across Europe, the 12th and 13th century, there was an increase in charitable giving. And we're not sure why. Of course, charity is one of the 7 Christian virtues. It may be that the First Crusade, some 40 years earlier, had given rise to the need to care for the returning disabled, who became a respected part of the population. It may be that the church started to grant indulgences for the forgiveness of sins to those who donated to the church, and then you didn't need to go on a crusade. Whatever the reason, many almshouses were founded, but when Henry VIII dissolved the monasteries, they disappeared. So in 1601, Elizabeth I's government tried to fill the gap with the Poor Relief Act, which made each parish responsible for those who couldn't work. We move on to the world's first incorporated charity. This is William Hogarth's portrait of the founder, Captain Thomas Coram. He was born in Lyme Regis and went to sea when he was 12, returned to England, what they described as an old man in age 52, became a successful merchant and was appalled by the abandoned homeless children living on the streets of London. So he obtained a charter from the king and established the London Foundling Hospital, a hospital for the maintenance and education of exposed and deserted young children. George Frederick Handel was a governor of the hospital, and he held a benefit concert performance where the Foundling Hospital anthem was played, and that included the Hallelujah chorus from his recently composed Messiah. William Hogarth was also among the first governors and used the governor's committee room to exhibit paintings by himself, Thomas Gainsborough, Richard Wilson and others. So the Foundling Hospital also became the first public art gallery. And this is the committee room where the paintings were hung. This is a painting by Emma Brownlow, and what it shows is a foundling girl being reunited with her mother. And you can see the mother's so overwrought she's dropped the receipt on the floor that she received when the child was first admitted. And that's the evidence she needs for her to claim the child back again. In fact, it was very unusual for a parent and child to be reunited. And this painting was seen at the time as more of a portrait of Emma Brownlow's father, because he was the hospital secretary. It's this gentleman here who was in fact himself a foundling. She, Emma Brownlow, was self-taught and modestly successful artist. I'll explain later the clear distinction that arose in Victorian period between the deserving and undeserving poor, but the distinction has, it's probably always been with us, but in the 18th century, the distinction was between, as we see here, industry and idleness. The Elizabethan Poor Law offered relief to the lame, impotent, which meant not able to function properly, old and blind. The able-bodied were set to work, and the idle and vagrants were sent to a house of correction or prison. Now here, Hogarth is showing us the difference between the two workers here and what they go on to achieve over a series of 12 plates. On the left, we can see Thomas Idle sleeping, and he goes on to lead a life of crime. And on the right, we can see Francis Goodchild, who's working hard. Now, Thomas Idle goes through a whole series of crimes in his life and eventually ends up here on his way to be hanged at Tyburn, while Francis Goodchild, through his hard work, becomes Lord Mayor of London. He's the one in the coach, by the way, holding the sword of state and wearing an outsized topped hat. It's in a way the American dream in England, the ability for anyone, whatever their background, to better themselves through hard work, which the Victorians also believed. Of course, as it's Hogarth, it's also a satire on the belief that hard work always brings such rewards. Here's another example of idleness versus industry, this time in a rural setting. This is by George Morland, showing the miseries of idleness. Here, the idle poor only have a bone left to eat, and the empty cask on the right suggests an earlier indulgence in alcohol, suggesting these people have only themselves to blame, and their lack of control has brought about their impoverished state, and a tragic fate awaits them. And we shall see this makes them the undeserving poor. On the other hand, the comforts of industry show a smartly dressed, well-fed family. The father has just returned home with his son and is casually dropping some coins in his wife's lap, while his daughter plays with a doll and welcomes her brother home, and the baby sleeps contentedly in its mother's lap. The irony is that Morland was a notoriously heavy drinker and debtor. He spent the final few years of his life in and out of debtor's prison and eventually died of alcoholism, aged just 41. Now, Morland was also a child prodigy. He started drawing when he was 3. His father started selling his drawings, and he was made an honorary member of the Royal Academy when he was 10. And his lifestyle was so unbelievable, so flamboyant, he became the subject of 4 anecdotal biographies immediately after his death. But let me pause briefly and ask, who were the poor? At the top of society there was royalty. There were about 180 peers of the realm and a few thousand gentry. Next rank down was the middling sort, businessmen and tradesmen. And at the bottom of society was the vast majority, about 97%, ranging from skilled artisans at the top to beggars near the bottom. It's thought that half the population were so poor they needed some sort of charity to survive. That was those whose income was under £25 a year. The other point to make here is that from the beginning of the century, 1800, 3/4 of the population worked on farms and 1/4 in towns, which during the 19th century switched. So by 1900, this was reversed and 3/4 lived and worked in towns and 1/4 remained in the countryside. Also, I should point out that at this point, at the end of the 18th century, pictures of the poor were popular. There was a fashion for sentiment, a heightened feeling of sympathy and pity that appeared in poetry, novels and the visual arts. And this is William Beechey showing 2 children giving charity to a beggar. But it's not all that it appears. It was commissioned by their father, Sir Francis Ford, and his motive wasn't sentiment. He was an MP and an outspoken advocate in favour of slavery. He argued the slaves he owned in Barbados had a better quality of life than the children in the slums in England. He lived in Ember Court, Thames Ditton, and his children are demonstrating how he and his family cared for the poor. In other words, this is a propaganda piece. It's a sort of visual argument in favour of slavery and showing how his family cared for the poor in England and by implication cared for his slaves in Barbados. Another popular approach to showing the poor was using humour. This is by David Wilkie, The Village Holiday, and he became a star in London art world painting this sort of work. He was much admired for his moralising and humorous narratives of everyday life. Today, of course, he's virtually unknown. What he's showing here is the wife of a drunken father and his daughter dragging him away, or trying to drag him away from his friends who are trying to drag him back again. So there's a moral element in the story, but most of the reviews written at the time see it more as just a jolly snapshot of everyday life. Here's one example from a magazine. The landlord on the left, pouring out ale with the air of one who knows the exact height and the precise angle at which to poise the bottle and manoeuvre the glass, is a jolly, ruddy, well-to-do specimen of a host of the olden times. And the article goes on like that, praising the representation of the poor. But overindulgence in alcohol was seen as a fault of the poor. And it wasn't until 1833 that Richard Turner first gave a speech advocating total abstinence from all alcohol, and the word teetotal was coined. Previously, in the 18th century, it was only strong spirits that were condemned, as we can see if you remember in Hogarth's Gin Lane, showing the evils of gin, compared with the patriotic and healthy beer in Beer Street. Another entertaining painting, this one by Benjamin Haydon, called Punch on May Day, showing a mixture of the wealthy and poor. It's set in Marylebone, and I just point out a few of the goings on in this painting. Over here we have Punch and Judy. Punch is beating his wife and has drawn the crowds we see here. That's blocked the road, and that's caused this marriage coach with the newly married couple. The man is looking out at the Punch and Judy show, and it's collided, I think, with this hearse here taking the dead to the cemetery. So it's a mixture of all of life here. Sitting on the curb down here is a poor fruit seller, arranged her meagre fare on the table. And this farmer here is so engrossed in Punch and Judy, he doesn't notice this hand about to steal something from his pocket. And the sailor here, who might have noticed, is being distracted by this woman who's hiding the child with her shawl and is distracting the sailor with her downcast eyes and her smile. There's a chimney sweep here with his broom, and over here it's an interesting group of three doing a Morris dance. One is dressed as a tree here. It's a person that we can tell because just there is his eye. It's a tree-like costume representing the Green Man or Jack in the Green. There's a woman in red dancing with a spoon or ladle, another part of the Morris dancing. And there's a black-faced boy here. Now, we don't know, there's been a lot of speculation about why they had blackened faces. One suggestion is that it's based on the name Morris dancing. Why is it called Morris dancing? And the name Morris dancing goes back to the 14th century and is mentioned in the courts in the Tudor period. It's thought to be derived from the Moors of Morocco, and so the black face is a representation of the Moors and Morris dancing. Although why the Moors of Morocco became part of the culture of England, I don't know. Another suggestion is that in the 14th century, farm workers would blacken their faces so they could beg for food in the winter without being recognised. I can't pass on without mentioning the country has seen a major war with France, resulting in many disabled men returning unable to find work. In addition, Parliament passed Corn Laws in 1815, which resulted in an astronomical increase in the price of bread. So in 1819, more than 60,000 people gathered at St. Peter's Field, Manchester, many dressed in their Sunday best. It was a peaceful crowd who just wanted to hear the speakers, but the cavalry were ordered to attack this unarmed crowd because the mayor was frightened of a revolution. The first casualty was a 2-year-old infant, and by the end of the day, some 14 to 18 had died and 400 to 700 injured. But it's this painting that is the one I wanted to talk about as the turning point in the Victorians' view of the poor and the way that they started to distinguish between the deserving and the undeserving poor. In 1843, Punch magazine Christmas album published a poem by Thomas Hood called The Song of the Shirt, and it's impossible to understand the enormous impact this had. Thackeray described it as the most startling lyric in the language. It was set to music, it was subject of a play and many sermons. In this painting by Richard Redgrave, called The Seamstress or Seamstress, was a reaction to the poem and was accompanied by these lines: "O men with sisters dear, O men with mothers and wives, it's not the linen you're wearing out, but human creatures' lives." And up to then, most paintings avoided showing the reality of poverty, but this painting was the beginnings of the tradition of the Victorian social realist painting, showing the poor, and in particular here the deserving poor. Just to go through the painting quickly, you can see from the clock it's 2:30 in the morning. The lit windows opposite show that there's other people still up, like this woman, and this woman, a seamstress, her eyes are swollen and inflamed because she has to do close work stitching by the light of a single candle. Seamstresses often went blind, and their wages, their meagre wages, were docked if they dropped a stitch. The medicine here is labelled the Mixture and Middlesex Hospital, and so that indicates that she is going blind but had to continue with the work. But in a way, it wasn't that moved the society. The point that struck home is that society woke up to the fact that the poor could be their own sisters, mothers and wives. Because in Victorian society the man was nearly always the sole breadwinner, and there were few morally acceptable jobs for women, if a breadwinner died, the dependents could be thrown on the street and go from being wealthy to poor overnight. The distinction between the deserving poor and the undeserving poor started to become established. In other words, simplistically speaking, the deserving poor were former middle-class people who, no through to fault of their own, were unable to house, clothe and feed themselves and their family. And another point I'll come back to is that this is not a fallen woman. This is a woman who is trying to make a living for herself, a morally acceptable living, and she's doing that even if it means going blind and eventually dying. I mentioned the death of the breadwinner could lead to destitution. This is another example of that happening in the road to ruin. An irresponsible and free-spending aristocrat, shown here, has been forced to sell the ancestral home. The sporting print bottom left indicates he's gambled the money away, and bottom right is a Christie's catalogue with lot numbers indicating he's got to sell the contents of the house as well. Over by the window, the grandmother is giving a £5 note to the butler as she weeps, and the butler who's now lost his job, is handing over the keys to the house. The man portrayed is Colonel John Leslie Toke, who was a friend of the artist Robert Martineau. And this was painted in Toke's family house, Goddington House in Kent. And bizarrely, life followed art. Toke inherited the house some 4 years after this was painted. But then, 30 years later, he had to sell a house which had been in the Toke family for over 400 years. It wasn't because he gambled, it was because he became increasingly burdened by debt because of the agricultural depression at the time. And this is an example by Augustus Mulready, remembering joys that have passed away, showing us two children that were formerly wealthy but have fallen on hard times. We can see that from the little girl's clothes, which she hasn't pawned yet. The boy is taken up the occupation of street sweeping, we can tell from the broom, and the little girl is reduced to selling matches. And perhaps her brother is recounting the joy of the pantomime to his sister. Maybe he was old enough to have seen it when he was younger and remember it. And they're now too poor, possibly orphaned, to ever visit a pantomime. They, of course, are the deserving poor. The deserving poor didn't automatically get helped by the state or by anybody else. And in 1867, Thomas John Bernardo, set up what he called a ragged school where children could get basic education. He abandoned medicine to look after the children and set up a home for boys where they were taught carpentry, metalwork and shoemaking. The school quickly became full, but when a boy was turned away and found dead of malnutrition the next day, he vowed never to turn away another boy. And interestingly, Bernardo refused to discriminate between the deserving and the undeserving poor and accepted all children, regardless of race, disability and circumstance. There's another appalling disaster that affected the poor in Ireland during the 1840s. And remember, at this time, because of the Act of Union of 1800, it was a United Kingdom of Great Britain and Ireland. Ireland was part of the United Kingdom. This is Daniel MacDonald's The Discovery of the Potato Blight, one of the few paintings of the famine. Now, the Irish had become dependent on a single food crop, potatoes, as it grew well and provided more calories per acre than any other crop. And the potato blight spread across Europe and particularly affected Ireland because the population was already suffering from extreme poverty and had few alternative food supplies. And they mostly grew a single variety of potato, the lumper, which was particularly susceptible to blight. The Great Famine was one of the most appalling acts of barbarity by the English. From 1846 to 1850, 1 million people died and another million emigrated, about a fifth to a quarter of the population. And the English response was inadequate and slow at best. And to add to the inhumanity, Ireland was still exporting 30 to 50 shiploads of food a day to Britain. And this was more than enough to feed the Irish population, so it was a preventable famine. Also at this time, a mass movement grew amongst the working class following the failure of the 1832 Reform Act to extend the vote beyond those owning property. They drew up a people's charter and became known as the Chartist movement. And there are a few paintings celebrating it. I've chosen this one, although it was painted much later. It's the opening of the Chartist Meeting House Hyde by Harry Rutherford. And it shows the local hero, Joseph Stevens, here talking from the platform, which is a cart, and he's soon to be arrested by the militia over here moving in. It's not actually a historic representation because Harry Rutherford wasn't there at the time, but it's a celebration of the Chartist movement. And this is a famous photograph in the Royal Collection showing a Chartist rally on Kennington Common in 1848. Now, 1848 was a time of revolution across Europe, and an enormous crowd gathered at Kennington Common with a petition with 6 million signatures from across the country. There were armed soldiers and special constables in the back streets, some 170,000. In this rally, there were the number in the rally variously reported, but historians now settled on a figure of 20,000 to 50,000. So far more soldiers and special constables on the back streets with cannon. The bridges were closed. A disaster and possible revolution almost happened, but was avoided by a hair's breadth. This demonstration here faded away actually by 2 o'clock in the afternoon. There were only a few children left playing on the fields. And as I said, revolution was avoided. There were some scuffles, but it never got any further. Did it fail? Chartism faded away after this point. Well, over the next 70 years, all the Chartist demands were passed into law, except for one. They wanted annual elections, and that didn't happen. Some might say thankfully. This is a work I put up at the beginning. I don't know whether you noticed it. I don't know whether you know the name of the artist and the title of the work. It's Samuel Files, Applicants for Admission to a Casual Ward. Now, a casual ward was like a workhouse, but you were only allowed to stay a single night in return for food in the evening, food in the morning, and working for a number of hours. What these people here are doing is queuing outside a police station to get a permit. Because you're only allowed to spend a night in a casual ward, each night you stayed, you had to get a permit, and you had to move on to a new district for the next night. So the woman with the child in the foreground, the baby and child, has a permit we can see in her hand, and the old man with the top hat on over on the left is, I think, asking the policeman the way to the casual ward he's got a permit for. I should say workhouses and casual wards were the result of the 1834 Poor Law, and its aim was not to help the poor. Its aim was to reduce the cost of looking after the poor, get beggars off the streets, and encourage poor people to work. And the conditions inside were specifically designed to be worse than the worst slums. Now, the worst slums were so appalling that conditions in even the worst workhouses couldn't match them without causing a public outcry. But the poor hated and feared the workhouse so much there were riots in the north. And this is an example of the sort of work that they would be given in the country. This is Henry Wallace's The Stonebreaker, and this was a common task, breaking up stones to make roads. It involved breaking half a ton of stones into small rocks in a morning. An onerous task even for the fit and healthy, but for the destitute and poorly fed it was literally often deadly. And this man is shown in his agricultural labourer's clothes, many critics assumed he was sleeping after a hard day's work, but there are a lot of clues that show, in fact, he's just died. There's a phrase from a Tennyson poem, "Now is thy long day's work done," on the frame. Muted colours, evenings falling, the setting sun gives a feeling of finality, and his posture, the way the hammer's fallen from his grasp, suggests that rather than putting it to one side to rest, it's just fallen out of his dead hands. And then the final, I think, convincing clue is the stoat. If you look down by his foot, and I've got a lightened version of it so that you can see it better here, by his right foot you can see there's a stoat, indicate that would only come up to him if he was dead. I said I'd mention the fallen woman. This is the music they've just been singing at the piano. Now, some critics thought they were brother and sister, but there are clues that they were a gentleman and a, shall we say, a fallen woman, a kept woman. The painting's by William Holman Hunt, and the clues are what to the Victorians would be regarded as gaudy furniture. There's down here skeins of wool, but all tangled. Over here under the table there's a cat playing with a bird, a bit difficult to see, but this is a bird with a broken wing. And final piece of evidence is this discarded glove, suggesting the woman is soon to be discarded by the man. The Victorians were in fact obsessed with fallen women. Women were expected to be pure and innocent, but were believed to be driven by emotion like children, and as a consequence men were expected to have to protect them, and the best place for that was in the home. Now, in this painting, we are to assume, I think, that this fallen woman has just had a sudden spiritual revelation. She's looked out into the sunlit garden that we can see reflected in the mirror behind her, and she's seeing God's work on earth. But the question arises, will she be redeemed, or will she continue on her path? In fact, I mentioned that men regarded it as their duty to protect women. That's a bit of a joke, really, considering that prostitution was a wide-scale problem in Britain. The number of prostitutes in London was staggeringly high. The police recorded some 8,600, but historians estimate the figure was closer to 80,000. And just to indicate what that means, a surgeon at the time, in his diary, claimed to have counted 185 prostitutes during one walk home from work. Another fallen woman in a slightly different context here. This is a painting by Dante Gabriel Rossetti called Found, that he never finished in his lifetime. He started it early on, and it's the only contemporary subject he attempted in oils, and he, as I said, never finished the work. What's going on here is that a young drover taking a calf to market has just recognised his former sweetheart and has jumped from the wagon to greet her, but she is a fallen woman, and the Victorians could tell that from her clothes. She is ashamed and so shrinks from his grasp. He tries to raise her, but she resists, turns her head to the wall, and like the calf, they are both trapped and both on their way to being sold. But she could possibly accept redemption, but will she, or like the calf, is she unable to escape her fate? When it was exhibited after Rossetti died, Lewis Carroll saw in the farmer's face a combination of pain and pity, condemnation and love, which is one of the most marvellous things I have ever seen done in painting. Final example of a painting of a fallen woman is the fate that Victorians saw coming to fallen women. It's by George Frederick Watts and it's called Found Drowned. And we see this woman who's just been pulled from the Thames underneath Waterloo Bridge. And the drama is increased by this this pose with outstretched arms. We can see in her left hand a locket and chain, suggesting the pose suggests she's a martyr to the injustice of the way in which women were treated by society. And this is from a book of photographs, Victorian London, Street by Street, by John Thompson, in which he describes the everyday life of 36 different occupations with detailed interviews. Surprisingly, all the people interviewed had a very positive outlook and plans for the future. Even the woman in the centre. She's called a crawler, which is someone who had to beg from beggars, and they literally crawled from place to place. They sat on hard stone steps day and night in wind and rain. They got therefore little sleep. But this woman looked after a baby from 10 in the morning to 4 in the afternoon for a cup of tea, which she said she didn't always get. Now, many of the crawlers were previously middle-class people who had fallen on hard times. This woman, for example, told the interviewer she was the wife of a tailor who had died. And you might imagine she was inarticulate, but actually she had positive plans for the future, which weren't completely impossible. Her aim was to save a few shillings in order to travel to the hop fields in the picking season, in order to save about £1, which was possible in the hop fields. And with £1, she could start work again. She could get her son's clothes out of the pawn shop and he could get a job. And she would rent a little room that she'd already identified in order to have an address so she could get a job. This is Hard Times by Hubert von Herkommer, and another example of the deserving poor. In this case, it's a man travelling the country with his countryside with his family to find work. He's physically strong, he's got a determined expression, carrying the tools of his trade with him. And it's painted by an artist who was born in Germany, but his family left Germany when he was 2 and went to America and then returned to Europe when he was 8 and settled in England in Southampton. And he was never properly educated. He didn't go to school. Well, he went for a few months, fell ill and never returned, but he was taught wood carving by his father and went to Southampton School of Art. And from there he went on. The first painting he exhibited at the Royal Academy sold when he was just 20 for 2 guineas. And by the time he was 24, he'd sold a painting for 500 guineas and was later made an academician. He's mainly remembered today for this painting, but at the time he was known for portraits, landscapes and so on. This is a scene of everyday life painted by Ralph Headley in Newcastle, and this is the ballad seller, the Black Gate, and he's accurately recorded a poor woman earning a living selling song sheets for ballads. Headley grew up in Newcastle and was apprenticed to a wood carver, studied at the Government School of Art and Design, and now first he set up a wood carving business, but then he started to produce lithographs for the local press and also worked as an artist. And he would have posed these figures in his studio rather than sketch them on the spot, and he used locals for models rather than professionals. This is the Black Gate in Newcastle, which was a castle that had fallen into disrepair. And that's what we can see here. In the 1880s, it was being repaired. And so she set up her ballad cellar stall alongside the works going on repairing the castle. And she's got a baby in her arms and is resigned and patient, and she's serving a grumpy man in what at the time would have been very old-fashioned clothes. This is Newgate Prison, and we're looking at what's known as the cage, where prisoners could meet visitors after sentencing. And you can see there's two lots of bars to prevent them touching, and there's a prison warden between the two lots of bars to prevent anyone touching. There are two families represented here, and we know from what was written about this the story behind this picture. On the left, far left, is a bank clerk who's just been sentenced to 5 years penal servitude for embezzlement, and Frank Hull is showing him as a weak man from a genteel background. The wife in front of him with 2 children is working class, and his mother on the far right, wearing furs and jewels, has the question about whether she's going to relent and make amends by looking after her grandchildren and daughter-in-law, who they were cut off by the rich family because their son married beneath him, and perhaps he embezzled the money to raise the wife to a level acceptable to his family. The second prisoner, I need to point to him here, is looking desperate, but his wife seems resigned to the fate. He's like a caged animal lunging at her, preventing him from attacking her. She and the baby are safely protected from his alcoholic abuse as long as he's in prison. Incidentally, engravings of this work by Frank Hull were admired by Vincent van Gogh, and Hull was extremely popular until the 1870s, when the art for art's sake movement took over and made it difficult to sell harrowing scenes of poverty and death. And many artists like Hull took up portrait painting, although he died aged only 43 a few years later and was forgotten within a few years. He's been rediscovered recently. This is Ernest Johnson, a Salvation Army shelter, and I wanted to mention the other great charity set up at this time. In fact, in 1865, the Salvation Army was founded by William and Catherine Booth in the East End of London, and they provided soup kitchens, rescue homes for abused women, and shelters for the homeless, like this one here. Their motto was soup, soap and salvation. The artist, incidentally, studied at the Slade and became Professor of Fine Art at Bedford College. And then finally, the last painting I wanted to show you one on a slightly happier note, which is painted by William Powell Frith. It's Ramsgate Sands, and shows a cross-section of society, the wealthy and the poor, inspired by a holiday he took in Ramsgate. I'll just show you a couple of points in the picture of interest. First of all, this little girl here is believed to be his daughter that modelled for the little girl bathing in the water. Right over here, just there, is a self-portrait of Frith. Over on the other side of the painting, there's a man with a telescope and a little boy with a telescope. This is a boy, he hasn't been breeched yet. The woman is looking annoyed at the man, and that's because his telescope is pointed over to the right, where these bathing machines would be wheeled into the water or pulled in by donkeys, and the women would exit from the bathing machines to bathe in the sea because it was thought to be good for your health. And so what he's looking at is the women coming out of the bathing machines. The little boy is, you can see, he's looking in a slightly different direction. He's probably looking out to sea at the ships. And then the only other point I wanted to make about this painting, there are many points I could bring out, is this man here is entertaining these women with little white mice. They're scampering around on the ground. The women are looking at them with an amused face. No jumping on chairs in fright in the Victorian age. It's a form of entertainment, and he expects to receive a few coins for entertaining them for a while with the mice. Which leads to my final slide of Eglantine Jebb and her sister Dorothy Buxton, who founded Save the Children in 1919. And they founded it to raise money for the children in Germany and Russia who were starving after the war. They were harangued by the crowds for supporting Germany. They were arrested for distributing shocking leaflets with pictures of starving children, but nothing stopped them. At their trial, they were found guilty and fined £5, but the judge was so moved, he paid the fine himself and became the first person to donate to Save the Children. They raised enough money to start advertising, and that enabled them to raise a lot more money for, as it says here, never in the world's history has help been more desperately needed. And the money was sent to Germany and to Russia. Russia's little ones, their utter helplessness claims first consideration, is what this advertisement in the press says. Just to return to England's poor, in 1905 the government introduced measures to help the poor, such as the first old age pensions, but it wasn't until the 1940s that William Beveridge argued the poor laws should be replaced entirely with a welfare state that would care for everyone from cradle to grave. And those changes, including the foundation of the National Health Service, were introduced in 1945. Finally, I'd like to read a summary. I don't know how many of you have heard of ChatGPT. It's in fact the fastest growing computer application ever launched, and it was launched on November the 30th last year. It just 5 days, it grew to 1 million users, and that took Facebook 4 years to grow to 1 million users. It has now passed 100 million users in just 12 weeks. What it is an artificial intelligence computer system that would discuss any issue, answer any question, write poetry, write essays, write songs, translate, and so on. And I asked it about the deserving and the undeserving poor, and this is what it told me. The deserving poor are individuals who are unable to provide for themselves or are facing circumstances beyond their control, while the undeserving poor are seen as having brought their poverty on themselves through their own choices or behaviours. However, these classifications are often based on subjective judgments and societal biases, and it's important to recognise that every person deserves basic human dignity and respect. Instead of focusing on whether someone is deserving or undeserving, we should work towards creating a more equitable society that provides support and resources for all individuals to thrive. I couldn't put it better myself. Thank you.